Section 25 of Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes. British Army Veterinary Corps. The Great War brought to the British Army Veterinary Corps its golden opportunity. For the first time in recorded military history, an animal-serving organisation was permitted to carry through a definite plan of its own. And the British service doubly justified itself, first to the broadly merciful impulses of all civilised people, and secondly, economically, to the overloaded British taxpayer. It is not too much to say of veterinary service in the armies of the Allied that the French and Italian were excellent, while the British from the beginning set an example to the world. At practically all times, British armies were adequately supplied with horses and mules by the remount service, and a large factor in this success was the efficiency of the veterinary service. And let America in her unpreparedness take notice that this efficiency was due primarily to the fact that the Corps was organised long before 1914. It was no mushroom growth of a night to meet a vital emergency. The British paid their bill for unpreparedness in the South African War of 1899 to 1902. They learned their lesson then. They took it to heart, and from that day gave time and thought to the creation of an efficient veterinary organisation, which when 1914 broke, was ready, requiring only expansion as needs arose. This efficiency was justified in its results. All that could be done for animals under war's terrible conditions the veterinary service did. In no previous war did animals fare so well. Of the many thousands of horses and mules sent to the British veterinary hospitals suffering from disease or wounds, 85% were reissued, cured. And above all, this very humaneness of man for beast brought nearer that higher civilization in which man shall be humane to man. The results of army veterinary efficiency did not fail to impress the public, whose taxes supported the service. People quickly learned that it is cheaper to cure a disabled horse than to buy a new one. They realized that animals were being bought and used by the 100,000, and they gave the veterinary service grateful support. Say what you will, a very sympathetic connection exists between the pocket and the heart. The British had no highly organised veterinary corps in the South African War. Their service then was somewhat akin to the American service of 1914. They had a few officers and veterinary surgeons whose duties were practically limited to professional attendance upon sick and wounded animals as chanced to come within their official scope, and the mortality among army animals was in excess of 55% for each year of the war. Compare that with an equine mortality of 9.4%, which was the highest for any year of the Great War, and the importance of the improvement in the British organisation will be appreciated. Wherever British troops went in the Great War, horses went, and wherever there were horses, the British Army Veterinary Corps functioned. At Salonika and Gallipoli, in Palestine, Mesopotamia, Africa, and France, it relieved suffering and conserved life. But that is not the end of the story. The service covered the entire field of the military use of horses. It saw to it that only sound animals were accepted. It inspected and bought the best in the horse markets of far countries, and it cared for these remounts in the overland and overseas journeys to England. It ensured the efficiency of animals with the field forces by preventing the introduction of contagious diseases, and by taking prompt measures to check the spread of such diseases as appeared. It worked right up to the farthest front, and prevented wastage by the prompt application of first aid. It evacuated the sick and wounded animals, the presence of which hampered the army's mobility and efficiency. It attended to the hospitalization of such animals, and handed them over, restored to health, to the remount service for reissue. It replenished veterinary equipment, and it maintained schools of farriery. It is worthy of notice that all the officers of the Corps hold diplomas from veterinary colleges with a 4-year curriculum. Farmers and breeders in the United States sold far in excess of 1 million horses and mules for British military use. British veterinary surgeons were present to pass on the soundness of each animal before acceptance. Other surgeons were on duty in the horse ships to care for the animals, nor was their work quite as carefree as yachting on a pond. In July 1915, for instance, the steamship Anglo-Californian, carrying 925 horses, met a German submarine off the Irish coast. A running fight of 3 hours ensued, during which the captain was killed. When the subordinates of the veterinary service put off in the ship's boats for safety, Civil Veterinary Surgeon F. Neal remained alone at his post and gallantly carried out his duties. Single-handed and under the enemy's fire, he attended the wounded men as well as the animals in his charge. 26 horses were killed, but the remaining 899 reached England in good condition, for which sole credit was given to Surgeon Neal. Even in the strain and stress of war, when gallant actions were not infrequent, Surgeon Neal's conduct was considered so noteworthy that the Admiralty thanked him publicly and presented him with a gold watch. Horses arriving in England were usually quarantined at depots for 6 weeks and then distributed among reserve units for training and conditioning. This preliminary completed, they were taken over at Swathelin by the remount service for embarkation to the various ports in France, and from these they were distributed under direction of the Director of Remounts in France to the armies in the field. Some horses, however, took longer to harden and were consequently given more time before being shipped, some cases even being sent to a veterinary hospital for conditioning. The veterinary and the remount services worked hand in glove. The great remount station at Swathelin was the neck of the bottle through which all horses were poured from England into France. The horses reached the 5 base stations fit for anything a horse could do. Other streams of horses were pouring into these stations from the veterinary hospitals and convalescent depots in France, where the veterinary corps reconditioned animals that had done a turn of work with the armies. Can you imagine the tales of service these veterans told the raw recruits from England in many an equine conference? The armies needed animals. They must be served. In each army the Director of Remounts tabulated the demands made upon him. So many mules, so many horses, in their classification of heavy draft, light draft, chargers. His requirements were submitted to the Directorate, and an order for the issue of the animals was sent to the nearest station. Sometimes the animals were forwarded by train, which saved time but used rolling stock that could ill be spared, so that the custom of sending by road became general. This plan was beneficial, for the march caused the animals to reach the front in better condition, and on the fitness of a single horse the lives of many a man might hang. On all the roads running fanwise from base stations towards the front, there were staging camps where men and horses rested overnight, with good water and abundant rations assured. Mile-long strings of horses and mules came and went. They were forever passing one another, the well and hearty and the sick and worn. It does not pay to cumber the front with sick animals. Indeed, it is criminal to do so, and it is up to the veterinary corps to pick them out and move them at the first sign of illness. And so the columns passed and repassed, some towards the guns and some to the comforts of the hospital and the sweet green grass of rest camps. Whenever another yard of grounds had been bought at a great price, and the front had bulged forward into no man's land, the men crawled ahead, and the horses followed into the churned chaos. These horses were no spirited war chargers, but just equine hewers of wood and drawers of water, so to speak, doing their humble and necessary bit in mortal discomfort. They had left all sound footing, and were sinking in mud. They pulled and hauled at their tremendous loads, and no matter how the mud stuck and clung, no matter how it seemed to grow deeper and deeper, they got their burden through. What is more, they did the work over the ground where lorry and tractor would have been useless. There they were, unsung heroes of the war, the faithful horse and the steady mule, plunging on, knee-deep, keeping close to the line of men with food, supplies and ammunition. With a lull in the work came a rest for the horses. But did they rest? Never in such mud, for there was no standing for them. When they halted, they sank in mud. They pulled up one leg, the other sank deeper. Growing weariness their lot, and sickness near. No horse could stand in that mud and keep well. Back of the lines war was indeed hell for horse and mule. Field Marshal Haig was always deeply interested in animal welfare. Moreover, he became impressed by the menace to victory occasioned by the terrific wastage of animal life during the hard winter of 1916-17. Heavy rains had turned Flanders and the district of the Somme into appalling morasses. Wheeled traffic had been abandoned, and horses and mules had become pack animals, and thus loaded, had often been swallowed up in the mud. To cap disaster, there had been a shortage of oats, but the underfed, overloaded animals had been kept at work to the end. For many, the end was not far off. During 1 month, the percentage of losses increased to an appalling figure. At long last, however, better weather came, the full ration was restored, and the disability percentage dropped. Intensive instruction in the care of horses was now undertaken, so that the labours of the Veterinary Corps might find support in the increased intelligence of the men making daily use of the animals. A horse-master was appointed in each army corps, with subordinate horse-masters in each minor unit. They maintained a watchful eye, gave advice, and worked unceasingly for the improvement of the necessarily hard lot of the animals. The good work was helped along by the Director of Veterinary Service in France, who instituted at each of the hospitals a 10 days course of instruction for artillery and infantry transport officers. About 350 officers took the course each month, and the need of such instruction may be surmised from the incidents. One young officer, enthusiastic but ignorant of horse law, lodged an official complaint as to the quality of the rations furnished. The oats, he wrote, were so small that they lodged in the horses' teeth. Indent for toothpicks was the ironical advice he secured. He was guyed unmercifully by his comrades, some of them probably as ignorant as he. Later this officer filled a line vacancy, went over the top and won the M.C. Then all was changed. This intensive instruction bore good fruit, more especially as the number of animals employed steadily increased. In the following spring, for instance, 30,000 horses and mules were cared for in the British veterinary hospitals and convalescent horse depots. The animal situation steadily improved until the wastage actually reached a lower figure than had been shown during 1912. That is to say, there were fewer deaths from enemy gunfire, disease, castings, missing, and all other causes that must be taken into account during war, than there had been during a year of peace. There is cause for congratulation in such a record. The horse never lived that could carry on in endless quagmires and remain the horse he had been. Working and standing in mud caused a number of special diseases, such as grease, cracked heels, sloughing of the skin around coronet and pastern, and ulcerative cellulitis. This last is a particularly ugly trouble produced by a microbe which attacks the legs, creeps up, and may in time enter the body and assail the kidneys. When this happens, the horse is doomed. The number of foot injuries was very great, the principal cause being picked-up nails. Several hundred cases of quitot occurred weekly from this cause alone. The material for troops came packed in light wooden cases, and as these were opened and burned, the nails were scattered broadcast. Efforts were made to prevent this danger, but they were only partially successful, and inventive genius was turned towards devising a practical metal protection for the sole of the foot. Heavy draught horses are peculiarly susceptible to respiratory troubles. Fever and catarrh find them easy victims, while general debility was the greatest hospital filler. All horses are sensitive to changes of climate, food, and water, and they are susceptible to contagious diseases, being less robust than mules. As to gunshot wounds, the horse, despite his greater size, is less susceptible to injury than man, for its hide has greater resisting power. The veterinarians performed wonders in their treatment of wounded animals. One surgeon was fond of displaying the 27 shell splinters he had extracted from one horse, which subsequently returned to duty. One of the young, untried surgeons of the Veterinary Corps rescued a German horse with 3 bullets in its shoulder. He was advised by his superiors to give the poor beast the bullet of mercy, for the wound was a neglected one, but the young surgeon persisted in his attempt to operate. He was successful, and the horse lived to serve against its late owners. Disease went and came in waves. Parasitic skin diseases have always been one of the war's distressing accompaniments. Both men and horses suffered from lice. The memory of the cootie is undying. But a far worse scourge for the horse was mange. Entire hospitals were devoted to the treatment of this disease, which was especially virulent in winter. Sarcoptic mange, the worst form, is caused by a parasite that burrows under the skin and lays its eggs. Formerly oily dressings were applied to parts affected. The modern treatment, both for prevention and cure, is to dip in a calcium sulphide bath. Hundreds were dipped daily. The bath deteriorates after a couple of thousand horses have been through it and must be renewed. Judicious feeding on a nourishing diet, patient nursing, and good grooming are parts of the cure. Occasionally animals were treated by being placed for 2 hours at a time in chambers filled with sulphurous acid gas, their heads alone protruding into the fresh air. Next to mange, ophthalmia was the chief source of anxiety. The first symptom is conjunctivitis, a membranous inflammation which causes watering of the affected eye. In time, an opaque film settles over the iris, causing blindness, either partial or total. In either case, the animal loses much of its usefulness. Among horses in the South African War, a form of ophthalmia was rife that in many cases caused the eye to burst. The form common in France was known technically as iridocyclitis. It was peculiarly a war disease, induced by low condition, exposure, irregular exercise, and errors in feeding. Symptoms are alleviated by a hypodermic injection just above the affected eye. Possibly the precise cause of the trouble is not yet known. It seemed to some observers that American horses that had been fed on cottonseed were especially subject to ophthalmic attack, but this was not definitely established. But even the noblest horse cannot forever endure the rack of war. He cannot serve time after time, and time after time fall back for repairs, and then renew his strength and unabated vigour. At length there comes a day when he has earned his discharge, and the veteran stands dumb before his judges. His record speaks for him, and the final judgment of the Veterinary Board, like their care of him from the first, will serve both humanity and utility. It may be that the veteran is adjudged to be past all work, that life holds for him no more duties to be done. Then his gallant life is brought to an end, and the body that harboured an indomitable spirit may serve as food or be reduced for by-products. But it may be that a happier fate awaits him. If there is still some work in the old horse, he may find a home in the quiet routine of the farm, where one may hope some humane and intelligent owner will always bear in mind his 4-footed workman's record of war. The British Army Veterinary Service, in all its magnitude, may briefly be summarised as follows. It is organised under a director, with his assistants. In order follow 1. Veterinary officers with field units, 2. Mobile veterinary sections, 3. Veterinary hospitals, 4. Veterinary convalescent depots, 5. Depots of veterinary stores. Nothing in the entire organisation is more interesting than the Army Veterinary Stores. Here are stored drugs, bandages, all kinds of equipment for the service of Army animals, ready to be shipped to every quarter of the globe, with the sole exception of India, where a separate service is constituted. The great contract department of the veterinary stores advertises for samples. When the samples are approved, hundreds of tons of supplies are ordered. In the stores, these wholesale supplies are separated into smaller quantities, and when an indent or requisition is received, a wheeled table is moved from shelf to shelf, the items collected on it and checked. In the packing sheds they are checked again. Some of the original shipments at the beginning of the war ran as high as 300 tons, but during the war the largest week's output was 50 tons. It was after the signing of the armistice that I had the opportunity of inspecting two great veterinary hospitals at Tidworth and Bulford. They proved to be delightful examples of that efficiency that held up and did not crack under the strain of war. I reached them from Salisbury, where I made the acquaintance of another British system that stands up well, the English Inn. It was a very old and rambling structure, with an air of competent hospitality in all its fittings. It antedated skyscrapers by centuries. It covered much ground. A chance guest searching for his room might well have resorted to the use of a pocket compass. Walls were hung with sporting prints, tables piled with magazines. In the dining room, behind leaded windows, I was served by a dignified old waiter in evening clothes, and enjoyed a good lunch, well cooked and very hot. After lunch we drove with a soldier chauffeur by the old Roman fortifications of Sarum, along an old Roman road, across Salisbury Plain. It was mid-March, and the yellow gorse was bursting into bloom. A raw wind drove a thin, stinging rain against our faces, and through it we saw farmers at the plough, where farther along rolled the wide grass country where tens of thousands of England's youth had drilled to meet the sudden call to arms. We looked out over the camps where at one time 250,000 young men had been assembled. There were the trenches cut through chalky soil behind barbed wire entanglements, and there the bayoneted dummies, the scaling fences, the loopholed walls, all the mimicry of war. But the men themselves had done their work and gone on, some to die for king and empire, some to serve again in the fields of peace. Such was the setting of the countryside through which we drove, through Bulford and on to Tidworth, an army post which had had a pre-war veterinary hospital with 100 case capacity. It was a surgical hospital with all equipment for operations, while Bulford, on the other hand, was equipped for handling contagious diseases. During the war, Tidworth Hospital served about 9,000 animals. I found it under the command of Captain Barry, an officer so keen for its reputation that he did not only spare his strength and his efforts, but even, so it was reported, spent a portion of his private income to maintain the hospital at its high level. This spirit, which was widespread, accounts for much of the success of the service. In immediate charge of the hospital was a young veteran who had been with General Townsend at Kut el Amara, and had been taken by the Turks, had escaped and been recaptured, and had at length been liberated after the armistice. It fell to him to show us the hospital. The building was fitted with loose boxes about 9 by 12 feet square, and had high ceilings, whitewashed walls, windows for light and ventilation, and grooved tile floor. The tiles were laid in various patterns, as if for test, those with parallel grooves lengthwise of the stand, probably being the best from point of cleanliness. Cast iron fixtures in each box were fitted with galvanized iron receptacles for food and water. In some boxes a net bag containing hay hung on the wall, a device that prevents waste and keeps the patient content during the night. The similarity to human medical practice was indicated by the chart hanging in each box, giving the number and a brief description of the patient, name of ailment, and daily temperature. There were larger stalls designed for 2 horses, each being tethered, and a long pole or bail bard swung on chains between. Horses could readily get a leg over the pole, but could just as readily get it back again. The dispensary carried all necessary drugs. I noticed also a dipping vat, a furnace for burning infected bedding, a drying sheet for damp bedding, and a large iron retort for the dry sterilisation of blankets. The large, well-lighted operating room was divided down the middle by a low concrete barrier. On one side was a bed of coir mats covered with heavy canvas tightly stretched. This was the operating bed. Horses needing operations were brought in here. Their shoes were removed to prevent the cutting of the canvas, a strap adjusted at each fetlock, and the feet drawn close together and secured with a chain. The patient then sank upon the mattress. If the operation involved pain, 4 ounces of chloroform rendered the animal insensible. On the far side of the room were tables with glass cases containing instruments, bandages, absorbent cotton, and so on. No professional appliance was lacking, and the humanities rule. At Bulford I found an establishment which before the war could serve 400 animals, expanded 5-fold. The new temporary tables were chiefly long sheds, entirely open at the back, where the horses were tethered, with plenty of interval between. They were clipped short, but well blanketed for protection against raw winds. Along the roads between sheds were long metal watering troughs, which labelled with the name of some disease as mange. Horses thus affected were watered and fed at regular intervals at the call of a bugle and under the eye of an officer, so that mistakes seldom occurred. Contagion was rigidly guarded against at all times. General veterinary and medical practice march together as far as hygiene, sanitation, and antiseptics go. They diverge at the point of speech. The man can declare himself sick, the horse cannot. Therefore, a keenly trained power of diagnosis is the veterinarian's first qualification, and rigid daily inspection must be made if the animal is to be protected. To these inspections a large number of patients owe their successful treatment at Bulford. Ordinarily, when a patient comes in, he is clipped clean with an electric clipper, thoroughly brushed with an electric revolving brush, and given a bath. If he shows even the beginning of mange, the signs are apt to become apparent, and his next trip is to the dipping vat. This is a long, deep well, filled with a steaming, creamy fluid of calcium sulphate. It stands near the building in which the chemicals for the bath are mixed, and in which there is a heating arrangement for raising the temperature of the bath to the necessary point of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The animal plunges into the well at one end and is submerged. He swims along a few yards, and at the far end scrambles out by means of an inclined plane. Then he is scraped clean, walked about until dry, blanketed and tied. The process is repeated several times before convalescence is entered upon. I was shown the worst case of mange in the hospital. The patient, a horse, had lost practically all the hair of the sides, belly, withers, neck, and head. These parts were white and appeared perfectly smooth. So tender was the skin that sulphur vaseline had been substituted for the calcium sulphide bath. Many of the hair follicles had been destroyed, and the coat could never regain its former thickness, but the horse was recovering, and like all the other patients I saw, looked well fed and contented. A feature of the equipment was the clipping machine that could quickly be converted into a grinder for putting an edge on the clipping knives. A special room was set apart for mixing the rations of grain and chops, which ensures better mastication of the grain. Turkish baths with wet and dry steam were being installed, with a thermometer outside so that the attendant would not have to be inside with the patient. Too much emphasis cannot be laid on the proof seen in these hospitals that England had profited by the lessons of the South African War. Thoroughly efficient in peace, they had only to continue functioning as usual when war broke out, but on a larger scale. And the model being already in existence, it was not a difficult matter to establish similar hospitals at other suitable points. Competent animal backing for the men of England's armies was thus assured from the beginning of hostilities, and absolute dependence was placed on the Army Veterinary Corps for the supply. I wish it were possible to state just what share of final victory was due to the loyal devotion and efficiency of this service. The unknowing public, with its attention glued to the firing line, would be surprised. But that may not be. Enough to say that of all the intertwined factors, none was more vital. End of section 25.
Section 26 of Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes, work of Humane Societies. With all its efficiency, there was never a moment in the war when the Army Veterinary Service did not face demands in excess of its power. Wastage of animal life was terrific, yet success depended so greatly upon animal help that no efforts could be spared to keep the supply somewhere near the demand. Buying new, sound horses was one thing. Restoring the sick and injured was another still more important. But there was an ally. The overworked Army Veterinary Service everywhere was helped, strengthened, sustained by the Humane Societies of England and America. Perhaps the Blue Cross was first in the field. This is a branch of the Dumb Friends League in England and dates back to the Balkan War. Its object is to alleviate the sufferings of horses and other animals in time of war and the chaotic smash of peace establishments which accompanied the German rush through Belgium upon France gave it sufficient scope. Both French and Belgians were in dire need of its help, for both were taken unprepared. Its response was prompt, generous, and continuous. Base hospitals were established into which streams of disabled animals poured. It was claimed that the worst cases were sent to the Blue Cross hospitals, and this may well have been true at first, when the Blue Cross was able to give better service than the Army could. When Italy came into the war, the Blue Cross extended its support to the Italian organization of the same name and continued to finance it. Excellent work was done for Italian horses. All who saw anything of the Italian Blue Cross hospitals confirmed this. The advent of English forces into Europe brought British animals also to the Blue Cross care. Perhaps this lightened the work of soliciting financial support for some people, afflicted with a kind of super-patriotism, had refused support on the ground that only French horses were treated. Patriotism is a fine sentiment, but it is a sentiment to which dumb animals are unable to respond. Any animal needing help was given all the care possible at Blue Cross hospitals. The work of the Blue Cross was active and wide. It furnished 2,000 units of the British Expeditionary Force with a great variety of veterinary requisites. It maintained horse ambulances, fully equipped, in various camps. It presented a motor horse ambulance to the British forces at Salonika and another to the Canadian. And before the war was half over, it was appealed to by the French government to establish in Paris a fully equipped canine hospital, and to add kennels to each of its hospitals in France, where the chiens de santé, which were employed in large numbers, might be treated by the Blue Cross veterinary officers, and the Blue Cross gave the precise response that was desired and expected. The Blue Cross hospitals in France were said to be the largest and most up-to-date institutions of their kind in existence. Mr. Charles W. Forward said of them, "Their very sites were selected with care, and they are all close to running streams, so that a plentiful supply of pure water is always available. They all boast of spacious sheltered meadows where the horses can freely graze. Each hospital has its own operating room, pharmacy, sick wards, and isolated quarters for those animals suffering from some contagious disease, such as mange." In the British Army, Provision is made for the employment of persons who are interested in humane measures and are anxious that there shall not be unnecessary suffering. It is recognized that such persons are able to do many things that add to the comfort of animals and to the pleasure of those having them in charge. It is provided that all offers of veterinary assistance, when accepted by the Army Council, shall be supervised by the Director of Veterinary Services of the forces in the field. This brings volunteer work under military control. It gives assurance that the work will be properly supervised and the funds profitably expended. At the beginning of hostilities, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals volunteered veterinary assistance. The offer was accepted by the Army Council. This society is one of the oldest organizations of its kind in the world. It is directed by Mr. Edward G. Fairholme, who enlisted in the British Army Veterinary Corps and was given the rank of captain. Thus, he was in a position to ascertain how diseased and injured animals were handled and what was most needed, information which aided wonderfully in the obtaining of funds to carry on the Society's army work. The Society helped primarily by finding men with the right knowledge of horses and steering them into the veterinary service. Very soon the Army Council accepted its offer to start a fund for sick and wounded horses, with which to purchase veterinary supplies and establish hospitals. The fund was generously sustained and efficiently administered, and did much to improve the lot of horses in distress. The Society realized at the outset that work for animals on the battlefield could only be done effectively if organized by a personnel specially trained for the purpose and under military orders. Therefore, the committee of their war funds concentrated attention on the provision of horse ambulances, motor lorries for the carriage of fodder, etc., corn cutters, chaff cutters, rugs, bandages, and other requirements. It also built and provided hospitals for 2,500 horses on the lines of communication. A special stress was laid on the motor ambulances, in which 1 or 2 disabled horses might be transported, and later on the American organization also paid attention to the provision of these ambulances, which were of great help in saving equine life. They made it possible to transport wounded animals to hospitals, where operations could be performed and the horse restored to usefulness. Field Marshal Lord Hague, in acknowledgment to the Duke of Portland, chairman of the fund, wrote, "As you are aware, animals have been exposed to very severe trials and hardships, and have suffered heavily, not only as battle casualties, but through the exhaustion and loss of health consequent on the severe stress of work. Their lot has, however, been greatly lightened and their comfort in sickness materially added to by the assistance which the fund has been able to give. I would specially like to express my thanks for the provision of motor horse ambulances, which have served so many animals and have proved indispensable adjuncts to veterinary service. Also, are the veterinary hospitals complete with every known convenience for up-to-date surgical and medical treatment. May I offer my congratulations and express my appreciation on the work which has been achieved by your committee and helpers. The valuable aid afforded by these ambulances is indicated by a letter written by a veterinarian in the field. Yesterday morning, I had to get the horse ambulance to take away a wounded mare. She had been sent down to me 3 days before with a bad wound in the elbow. It became worse, and she could not put her leg to the ground, but would stand looking around for someone to come and take away her pain. So I got the ambulance. It was padded inside, and we hoisted her in with a padded block to support the bad leg. Then we tied ropes to hold her steady, and off they went. Queerly, she looked over the top of the box at the lines of wondering horses, and queer it was to see her, who had bravely done her share of pulling on stricken roads at midnight among the crashing shells and whistling shrapnel, no longer pulling, but being pulled away to a horse's hospital. I hope they saved her. She was a good mare. The work of these societies was closely watched by similar organizations in America. The American Veterinary Medical Association and the American Humane Society sent a representative to the war area whose mission was to study the usefulness and the care of horses in war. The preliminaries found concrete expression later when the American Red Star Animal Relief was formed. This society, whose functions were included in the general service of the American Humane Association, was part of an international movement for the relief of army animals that had been started in Switzerland in 1914. Dr. William O. Stillman, then president of the American Humane Association, became Director General of the organization in the United States. He had before his eyes the example of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which had created a service that was of great aid in reducing the hardships of British Army animals. That the United States would be drawn into the struggle was so evident to Dr. Stillman that he proposed to the Secretary of War that the American Humane Association should provide a similar service for the American Army. Correspondence proceeded, and in May 1916, Secretary of War Baker wrote Dr. Stillman in appreciation of the offer and pointed out that all countries in time of war must depend to a large degree on the voluntary assistance of citizens, especially in the case of the sick and wounded, both men and animals. That the American Red Cross had been proclaimed by the President in 1911 to be the only volunteer society authorized to render aid to American land and naval forces in time of war. Therefore, all other societies wishing to assist could function only through the Red Cross. In 1917, the Red Cross was busy organizing base hospital units and other formations that included both personnel and equipment, and it had its field in assisting the government in the care of its human sick and wounded. Secretary Baker later wrote that the American Humane Association could very well function similarly toward the sick and wounded animals in the country's armies. Steps were immediately taken to popularize the work, and 125 branches were established throughout the United States. The intensive method of the drive, the accepted method of the day, was resorted to, and in mid-December of 1917, the Christmas spirit of helpfulness was utilized in giving the appeal greater urgency. "You can get along without horses everywhere but in war," was the phrase quoted from Army officers, and the horses had to be cared for. The appeal was resistless. Latent in everyone was the spirit of the animal lover, and large sums were collected. When training camps and remount depots were established, the field work of the Red Star began. Several veterinary ambulances, motor or horse-drawn, were furnished to cantonments. Automobiles and motorcycles were furnished to enable camp veterinarians to visit sick or injured animals at distant points. Several supply buildings were erected for the use of Army veterinarians, and large quantities of bandages, surgical equipment and drugs, stable supplies, including blankets, fly nets, brushes, clipping machines, brooms, emergency shoes, etc., were sent to Army camps at the request of veterinarians. Over 150,000 first aid to armored horses leaflets were supplied to soldiers detailed with horses upon the request of officers and of the soldiers themselves, as well as of veterinarians. In such ways, the Red Star found ample outlet for its energies during the period of preparation that preceded actual conflict. It was of great value, not only in the information spread and the actual relief afforded enemy animals, but also in the impetus given to animal protection in scores of cities of the United States. Meanwhile, the American Red Star Animal Relief was pressing the War Department for official recognition. Perhaps the method in vogue with the British appealed to them. but that method was based upon the British Army Veterinary Corps, a methodical organization of many years' standing and experience, and the United States Army was barren of any such organization. Consequently, Washington was not inclined to follow the British lead in its entirety. Both the Secretary of War and the Surgeon General were inalterably opposed to the grant of any degree of official recognition to the Red Star that would authorize or enable it to go before the public and solicit money on the ground of the nation's need or of any pressing need of animals in the Army. There was no shortage of public funds. Both declared that Congress had appropriated all the money necessary to meet the requirements. That was true. But what was also true was that the Army Veterinary Organization, which should have been entrusted with the administration of affairs and the expenditure of that money, was existent in name only. The control of the Army Skeleton Veterinary Service had been transferred to the medical department but a short time, and the Surgeon General was having plenty of trouble in building a workable veterinary organization on modern lines of the size required. The injection into official confusion of a civilian element could only result in making confusion worse confounded. The government's resources were known to be adequate, and efficient and experienced officers from the British Veterinary Service were in Washington giving friendly aid. It was in no spirit of boastfulness that our Army officials expressed their confidence in the ability of the Army to care for its own animals. This clash of interests remained unadjusted until June 7, 1918, when Secretary of War Baker defined the precise status of the Red Star organization, and this was followed by Circular No. 25 from the Office of the Surgeon General, limiting the conditions under which a veterinarian was authorized to accept gifts from organizations for use in the performance of his official duties. The official provision ran thus: in a manifest emergency, when some particular article is not available when needed, it may be accepted. This applies only to supplies and equipment on the official veterinary supply table. Ordinarily, there should be no shortage of supply table articles. Investigations in this office have proved that the great majority of instances of shortage reported have been due to the failure of the responsible veterinarian to make proper requisition. Whenever a gift of this nature is accepted, prompt report will be made to the Surgeon General, stating the conditions under which it was obtained, the reasons for the existence of the shortage originally, and what steps may have been taken to prevent its repetition. Money gifts may not be accepted. Articles not on the veterinary supply table will not be accepted without the prior authority of the Surgeon General in each case. The only organizations from which acceptance of gifts has thus far been authorized are the Red Star Animal Relief and societies operating through the American Red Cross. On the basis of the last clause, the statement was given wide publicity that the Red Star and the Red Cross had been granted the same official recognition, and the solicitation of funds was pushed. An ethical point was involved, which has been the subject of wide divergence of opinion among people equally devoted to the work of relieving suffering, and possibly it never will be definitely settled. But whatever the fine edge put on the matter, it remains undeniably true that the Red Star performed a very valuable work from its beginning up to the last moment in which its service was needed. A point of which enthusiastic civilian would-be workers were sometimes oblivious was the painful lack of ship tonnage. This prevented many a willing patriot from taking a free trip abroad in semi-civilian status. If all the equipment and all the personnel thrust forward by various societies had been accepted and transported, there would have been few ships available for the 2 million fighting men that the United States placed in France. This was somewhat pointedly called to the attention of the Red Star when it proposed to furnish veterinary ambulances for use in France, following the service so successfully performed for the British by the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. These vehicles were definitely declined unless they could be manufactured in England, thus saving ship space for material deemed of more importance. It was feared that such manufacture would prove impossible, but Dr. Stillman was successful in enlisting the cooperation of Captain E.G. Fairholme of the RSPCA, who materially aided the American Red Star Animal Relief in having the desired motor veterinary ambulances built in England. 11 were built at a cost of more than $60,000 and presented to the American Expeditionary Force. Each would hold 2 animals. In accepting them, General Pershing said, "They will be of great service and will be turned over to our Veterinary Corps for its exclusive use." They proved to be a most valuable aid in transporting sick and disabled animals, and won high praise for the Red Star from the Army's chief veterinarian. A 2-wheeled horse ambulance, designed and built by the Red Star, proved so capable and popular that the government adopted the design and constructed a large number of them. Thus, the American Red Star Animal Relief was launched and won its way to recognition. The war did not limit the field of its labors, nor did the close of hostilities end its usefulness. It is still functioning in a wider field than before, a competent instrument in the hands of those who prevent animal suffering. Official recognition of the Red Star's war work came when it was granted permission to erect an artistic bronze tablet in the War and Navy Department building at Washington, commemorating the indispensable service rendered by animals lost in the war. The tablet was given a permanent position at the entrance of the War Department building, where it was unveiled October 15, 1921, by Mrs. Warren G. Harding, wife of the President. The inscription reads, "This tablet commemorates the services and sufferings of the 243,135 horses and mules employed by the American Expeditionary Forces overseas during the Great World War, which terminated November 11, 1918, and which resulted in the death of 68,682 of those animals. What they suffered is beyond words to describe. A fitting tribute to their important services has been given by the Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Forces, General John J. Pershing, who has written, "The Army horses and mules proved of inestimable value in prosecuting the war to a successful conclusion. They were found in all the theaters of preparation and operation, doing their silent but faithful work, without the faculty of hoping for any reward or compensation." This tablet is erected by Friends of the Horse and Mule in the United States under the auspices of the American Red Star Animal Relief, a department of the American Humane Association. Exercises of the unveiling and dedication were simple yet impressive. Presentation was by Director General William O. Stillman on behalf of the government. The presentation was accepted by Major General Willard A. Holbrook, Chief of Cavalry, USA. General Holbrook said in part, "Through ages of conflict and strife, the horse has been the constant companion and steadfast friend of the soldier, sharing his sufferings and dangers, his toils and hardships, and consecrating the battlefield with his blood. The mule, likewise, has been the Army's devoted friend, patiently bearing his burden that the Army might be supplied. Our British allies have paid high tribute to the splendid service rendered by the American horse and the American mule during the World War. Both were as indispensable to the successful prosecution of the war and to final victory as were shot and shell. Many mechanical devices were adopted as a partial solution of the problems of transportation involved, but in the last analysis, it was found that the requisite mobility for success depended upon the horse and the mule. They there remain today, as always, essential factors of successful warfare. While more than 68,000 of them serving with our armies in the World War passed to the great beyond in silent agony, and while many of them now sleep on the gentle slopes made beautiful by poppy's bloom, no white crosses row on row mark their last resting places. It is fitting and proper that praise and honor should be lavished on the armies of the victorious nations. Yet in doing so, we should not forget to render the meed of praise due the hundreds of thousands of horses and mules that died nobly in the cause of humanity. It is therefore with great pleasure and with deep appreciation that I now, in the name of the government of the United States, accept this beautiful tablet presented by the Red Star Animal Relief in commemoration of the horses and mules that died in the World War. This imperishable bronze will ever bear silent witness of the great debt we owe to our equine friends, and will inspire in the hearts of the present and future generations a determination to see that they receive the fair treatment and consideration which is their due. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. Animal Heroes by Ernest Baynes. Man's Animal Allies. From the first was strife. Man, emerging from the welter, fought his slow upward way. He was encompassed by danger. His life was the stake for which he forever fought. He fought beasts. He fought other men. When two men discovered a common interest, then was formed the nucleus of the tribe, the clan, the nation. When they fought common foes, their operations foreshadowed battles and wars. Man was of inferior physique, and was so built that he could not use his strength to full advantage, so he cast about for help. There was the animal that strangely seemed to bear him no ill will, that followed him in the chase and hung around his camps for food. It was the one animal that sought his society, so the dog came under control. He met man more than halfway. His domestication was brought about through companionship rather than through subjection, and he stood guard while his master slept, thus establishing himself in the role of loyal watchman. His immediate use lay in the protection he gave. Then man turned to advantage the speed of the dog. No one knows how long before recorded history this was, but the oldest Egyptian monuments depict what appears to be the greyhound used in the chase, fully as ancient as the testimony of herdsmen regarding the loyal sheepdog. The dog of old, however, was the incorruptible guardian of property other than flocks and herds. In those early days, fighting was the normal condition of mankind, and brave indeed and strong must have been the dog who guarded his master's property and fought off his enemies. No wonder that he entered into the heart of man as the first friend and ally from the animal world. Battles were hand-to-hand combats, with gunpowder yet to come. It was but a step to train dogs for attack as well as for defense. A warrior going into the fight was preceded by a slave leading a fierce dog, which, at command, attacked the enemy. Then the master would rush in with his club or knife, and the enemy, doubly engaged, would shortly become negligible, and the warrior could march on to his next victory. These were genuine dogs of war, and Shakespeare's reference is by no means empty of gory significance. But no man, tribe, or nation had a monopoly of dogs. The Roman Empire builders sent fighting dogs along with their legions, and they found them used quite as efficiently by the peoples with whom they fought. Strabo says that in Gaul the Romans went against dogs clad in armor. The Teutonic tribes used complete armor, headpiece and all, for their dogs. Specimens of it may be gazed at in museums today. The Spaniards made liberal use of dogs in their conquest of the Americas. They favored a breed of large mastiffs of a ferocity that matched their size. Some of these dogs were so efficient that they received salaries, which their masters drew for them. They were on the regular payroll. But the most murderous and savage pack of all canine conquerors was that brought from Spain by one Frederman, a German who followed Charles V to the peninsula. These dog warriors wore coverlets quilted with cotton to fend off the poisoned arrows of the natives. They were used in the subjugation of the Chibchas in what is now Colombia, and were more feared than a regiment of harquebusiers. Man soon learned the value of the dog's power of scent in the hunt, but failed utterly to carry it further. Camerarius relates what seemed to be an instance of marvelous intelligence when guard dogs distinguished between Christians and Turks. We would not be surprised by it today. Differing modes of living and of eating produce distinctive scents in people. Races differ in scent, so do communities. The dog's nose is a gift surpassing human intelligence. It never leads him astray. But as time went on, the scenting power began to be utilized, and at first it was employed against outlaw raiders. Bloodhounds were produced. In England, bloodhound evidence sent poachers to penal servitude. In this country, before the Civil War, bloodhounds were used to track runaway slaves. Their use today is worldwide. They are everywhere relied on to run down wanted men. But the savage traits have been bred out of the hound of today. He concentrates all his power on running the quarry to earth and shows no desire to injure him. In this aspect, he is a value enforcer of law, doing his part to sustain the civilization that he helped to build. Napoleon believed in dogs and used them. To Marmont, his order was, collect all the savage dogs you can and picket them down outside the ramparts to give warning of attack. In the Crimean War, the Russians used them with their sentries. The French maintained a system of sentry dogs in their colonies in Africa, in Cochin, China, and in Madagascar. How many valuable lives might have been saved had we made an intelligent use of dogs with our sentries in the Philippines? About the year 1900, interest in military dogs revived, and several European nations took up the study of dog service in their armies. Germany led the way, and German police dogs transferred to the military service gave good account of themselves. The Great War brought the messenger dog to the fore, and 3 distinct classes of dogs requiring 3 distinct systems of training came to be recognized. The guard dog was incorruptible, the police dog dependable, the messenger dog reliable. The human watchman might be bought, not so the dog. The soldier sentinel might fall asleep, never the dog. The battlefield runner might fail for many reasons and yet live, but the dog to his last breath would follow the line of duty. The dog is the only animal to take over a man's duties, and he does them in a better-than-man way. Of all the animals that have come into service of mankind, the dog is preeminent in intelligence. But that is not all. He is more than intelligent, for he is inspired by the love that merges into deathless devotion. He is more than burden-bearer, more than toy, more than companion. He fills posts of human responsibility. His integrity is unassailable, his loyalty supreme. "The more I see of men," said Frederick the Great, "the better I like dogs." And today there are those who hold that in accepting the company of man, the dog condescended to mésalliance. But man was aggressive. His forays covered an ever-widening area, and he needed more than the dog. He needed mobility. Herds of small, shaggy beasts, wild horses, roamed wood and wold, and Neolithic man spent much time in their chase. An occasional live capture resulted in partial subjugation of the animal. He was broken to man's use. He could bear man on his back, and when inventive genius produced the wheel and axle, the war chariot was but a step away. Before recorded history begins, the horse was definitely aligned with man and dog for the great march up the civilizing centuries. For man had now won definite superiority over the rest of creation, and his future was for time to determine. When history opens, the Libyans were good horsemen, and the Egyptians were using chariots. Nations that made use of the horse held the whip hand over their backward brethren. They were warring nations, the ones that urged civilization forward. The horse was their ace. He was bred for war. He symbolized sovereignty in an age when warfare was the world's ordinary condition. It was the fighters that recognized the asset of mobility to supplement strength and stature, who first organized cavalry. The ancient writings of the Bible teem with references to the might of the war horse. Solomon's cavalry remounts numbered 12,000. Ezekiel alludes to the Assyrian cavalry, captains and rulers clothed most gorgeously, horsemen riding upon horses. 20 centuries later, the imagination of Lord Byron was stirred by the vision of those Assyrian cohorts, gleaming with purple and gold. From Asia and Egypt, the use of the horse spread rapidly through Europe. Nations seeking the advantage over others took thought to his breeding, increasing his size, speed, power. Curiously, the Greeks lagged in the matter of employing cavalry, and though they made good use of the war chariot, their horsemanship developed slowly. The 6th century BC was passing before the Grecian cities owned formidable cavalry, but even then it was not developed as an offensive weapon. As the scepter of power passed westward to Rome, the chariot was still preferred, but the Romans improved the horse, and at Cannae they learned something about cavalry from Hannibal. When Caesar invaded Britain, he had become converted to cavalry, though he found occasion to praise the skill with which the Britons handled their war chariots. Early use of cavalry was limited by the difficulty of arming and shielding the horsemen. Later, on the hard Roman roads, there was trouble because the unshod horses went lame. Permanent roads antedated the horseshoe, which was not invented until about the 4th century of our era. It was time, for the day of the mailed knight was dawning. Ponderous horses were being bred to carry the great weight, and good foot protection was essential. Then came gunpowder. Armor was relegated to museums, and the period of mobile forces was fairly opened, with cavalry the notable arm. Cromwell's Ironsides set the pace, the most powerful cavalry yet seen in England. They did not wear armor, they were mounted on light active horses, and their mobility spread a dismay that surprised the Cromwellians themselves, as much as it did the enemy. The horse came but slowly into the possession of the common people. He was a luxury animal for the pleasure of the higher classes in the hunt, or a war animal for the king's service. Agriculture was the last use to which he was put. An old law in Wales forbade the use of horses in ploughing, and Henry VIII's Act for the breed of horses stressed the generation and breed of good and strong horses as a defense of the realm. The association of the horse with size and strength led to the use of the word horse in conjunction with other words to denote the possessions of those qualities. Thus we speak of horseradish, horse mint, horse nettle. Horsepower is still the term for the measure of mechanical energy. To attribute horse sense to a person is not entirely complimentary. indicating as it does the possession of rough common sense or instinct rather than fine reasoning powers. Nor in this is the horse maligned, for so far as his mental powers go, he has been but little improved through his long tutelage under man. He does not develop that depth of affection that endears the dog to us. On neither the rational nor the emotional side of this nature can much be said, but his inherited courage has always commended him to courageous man. As for his physical form, we mold it to suit our varied needs. In the opinion of many, a definite limit to the future use of the horse in agriculture has been set by the introduction of tractors and the development of wide area farming. This may be the case, and the census reveals a decided and steady decrease in the number of horses used on farms in the United States during the past 10 years. Beginning footnote. About 18,000 horses were used on farms in 1924 as compared with about 21,000 in 1915. End of footnote. Yet, it is doubtful if the horse will ever be entirely displaced. Be that as it may, however, he was first and foremost a war horse, and the motor and the tractor have only pushed him further into the fight. Tried out in the very pit of modern war's fiery furnace, he is still a creature of boundless courage. He proves himself invaluable and resumes his ancient function as a glorious ally in the making and upholding of the kingdoms of the world. The ass and the mule, humble kinsmen of the horse, came into man's life on the inferior plane to which their natures entitled them. They were docile. They yielded their strength to his control. From earliest ages they have been burden bearers, and as such have played their necessary but ignoble parts in all the wars man has waged. Even the little donkey, small and slow, has his share in the unseen work that rears the edifice of the years. Especially in rugged regions where pack animals are necessary, does he come into view as the warrior's worthy ally, for he bears a burden out of all proportion to his size. He is sure-footed, he is a stranger to hysterical stampedes, and he will live comfortably by browsing where the horse would soon become a hospital subject. The camel is the most curious of the burden-bearers man has impressed into service. He is the descendant of an ancient line, bringing into this modern day the characteristics that were his 4,000 years ago and more. Physically, he is well adapted to serve man in hot countries. He is built for the desert, and he has served well. He has been many animals in one. He has furnished strength for burdens, speed for journeys, hair for clothing, flesh for food. Small wonder that man has found this all-round servitor useful in war. But his use is limited to lands where he has a natural habitat. He has no physical adaptability like the horse, and his mentality is rudimentary. Unlike the horse, he has never endeared himself to man. He seems incapable of affection. It is sometimes said that a good-natured camel is unknown. Sir F. Palgrave summed him up. He is an undomesticated and savage animal rendered serviceable by stupidity alone. Neither attachment nor even habit impresses him. Never tame, though not wide awake enough to be exactly wild. The camel ranks as one of the most serviceable of the animals which man has won from the wild, but he protests in every service even while he submits. As to this dullest and least improvable of all man's lowly servers, Shaler's description is final. This animal belongs in an ancient and lowly type of mammal characterized by relatively small brains, and therefore of weak intelligence. But for its singular serviceableness in drought-ridden countries, it would probably have been hunted off the earth by the early men, as have been many other remnants of ancient life. Elephants added the majesty of their bulk to the pomp of war in early days. Before gunpowder was known, elephants carrying archers and javelin throwers on their backs were thought to be irresistible in a charge. Horses became panic-stricken before them. Against the unsteady ranks of Oriental armies, they were often efficient in breaking a line of battle, and at first they proved formidable even to the all-conquering Romans. But when it was found that stout resistance on their onset was likely to throw them into confusion, in which they did as much damage to friends as to foes, elephants lost prestige. Gunpowder changed war entirely and relegated them to the ranks of peace servants. The pigeon could have had no special value to man until civilization took definite form. The usefulness of the pigeon is based on its strong instinctive desire to return to its home. This suggested to man a way to send messages with speed. But civilization must have reached a point where communication with other men was desirable. Man must have had permanent dwellings for himself. The art of writing must have been discovered. So the pigeon is a latecomer to the list of man's allies, but he serves with great efficiency and bravery both in peace and war. Men were sending each other messages by pigeon post as far back as the days of Solomon. The art of training the birds was developed by the early Persians, and it is probable that the Greeks drew on that source for their news. Their various cities received the names of winners in the Olympic Games by bird messengers. The Romans learned from the Greeks and began to use pigeons as message carriers about 120 BC. That the birds did their duty well may be inferred from the fact that they were continued in use. 3/4 of a century later, Caesar was employing them as military messengers, and the value of the homing pigeon in war was established. The mleigh was besieged by Mark Antony, 44 BC. Decimus Brutus, shut up in the city, frequently communicated with Consul Hirtius by means of pigeons. The Crusaders used them in their campaigns to recover the Holy Sepulchre of the Saracens. In the 14th century, pigeons formed part of a telegraph system adopted by the Turks. High towers were erected at intervals of 30 or 40 miles. These were provided with pigeons, and sentinels were continually on watch to secure messages from arriving birds and to forward them by fresh bearers. These communications were written on thin paper and enclosed in a box of gold beaten to paper thinness itself. It was suspended from the neck of the bird. The time of arrival and of departure at each tower was noted, and to increase security, duplicate messages were dispatched a couple of hours after the original. Sometimes, instead of the elaborate enclosure in golden containers, messages were simply wrapped in paper. Moisture was apt to render such messages illegible, so the correct deportment of winged messengers was secured by bathing the birds' legs in vinegar just before flying. This was expected to keep them cool on the trip and reduce their desire for drinking or bathing. After this, pigeons fell into disuse, though the art of flying them was not lost. Early in the 19th century, the Dutch government established a military pigeon service in Java and Sumatra, obtaining their birds from Turkish sources. As recently as the invention of the telegraph, the sending of messages by pigeons had a limited vogue among stockbrokers and financiers. The siege of Paris by the Germans in 1870-1871 revived the practice. The French were completely isolated. They tried to send out messages by means of balloons, but there was no certainty that these fragile and unguided bearers would come to earth beyond the enemy's lines. Pigeons were a last resort, and the pigeons flew daily to tours where messages from London were received. These messages were at first sent on thin waxed paper, but this did not prove satisfactory, as the paper was sometimes pecked by the birds, or cut by the string, or wet through inadequate waxing. This resulted in the use of quills as containers. Holes were burned through the ends of the quill with a white-hot bodkin. Strings passed through the holes, and the quill tied longitudinally to a tail feather. This method gave satisfactory security. The amount of information one bird could carry was astounding. At first, the dispatches were photographed on a reduced scale on the wax paper, but later thin films of collodion were substituted for paper. The dispatch was first printed in ordinary type on a folio page, then microphotographed on the collodion on a scale of 1/500th. Each collodion pellicle measured less than 1 by 2 inches, and each carried the reproduction of 16 folio pages, sometimes including as many as 3,000 messages. The pellicles were so light that 18 could easily be carried by a bird. This meant about 50,000 messages, if need be, to the single carrier. During the 4 months of the siege, more than 150,000 official and many million private messages were sent. When a pigeon arrived, the quill was detached from the tail feathers, the pellicles taken out, flattened, and enlarged on a screen by means of an electric lantern. Clerks copied the messages, which were then forwarded to their destination. After a time, sensitized paper was substituted for the screen so that the messages could be directly printed and distributed. Since then, the military use of pigeons has been generally revived, and the birds are now admittedly on par with other necessary features of military equipment. When we plume ourselves upon the accomplishments of man, we shall do well to pause in our self-gratulation to reflect upon the magnitude of the services rendered by our animal allies. Can one imagine man deprived of his comrades and helpers, the dog and the horse, on the long, weary march down blood-drenched centuries? And what could have supplied the place of his faithful burden-bearers, the ass, the mule, and the camel? Could man have attained to his high position had he lacked the support of these strong, loyal, and courageous friends and servants? Answer these questions as you will have to concede that the side without animal allies in the Great War would have been the side doomed to go down in defeat. 2,500 years ago, Aesop taught in fable the lesson of cooperation. It is the great lesson of the 20th century. Commerce has learnt it in part, but statesmen and peoples are still struggling blindly, for they have not learned it. Yet through all recorded time, we have been teaching the lesson to the animals we have tamed and trained. The debt we owe them for their cooperation is incalculable. Yet it is as dimly recognized as is our duty towards these, our little brothers and sisters of a lower creation. Our debt is something that can only in a measure be set down. Our duty towards them should be part of our religion. To the fine nature, gratitude and kindness are as divine command. We fail and fail, but ever we are reaching out to better things, to a future when justice and kindness to the animal creation will be part of a man's conduct and of his very nature. End of section 27. End of Animal Heroes of the Great War by Ernest Baynes.